All right, guys, guess I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to give an overview of some methods we can do inside of the editor now with multipass rendering. You're probably thinking, what exactly is that? Well, it really unlocks the potential of artists and technical artists to do things that previously would have required a graphics programmer to help you prototype them. And I'm kind of going to show a bunch of different examples today, starting from very simple, building up to more and more complicated, up to a full fluid simulation that you can create entirely with blueprints and materials inside of the editor. And also just some general content creation techniques that you can use this kind of stuff for. So you're probably thinking, what is multipass? It's not from the fifth element. It's actually any time you're compositing multiple renders of different elements in your scene. And we're going to show some examples of that with things like character HitMask damaging, where you want to be able to control exactly what you're doing to the texture. So the main methods that we're going to talk about here involve drawing directly to render targets. Oh, I guess I'm a slide behind. Hang on, sorry. The main methods we're going to talk about today are drawing directly to render targets with blueprints, and then making it a little bit more advanced, using a scene capture actor to get a little bit more information about the scene, like to do effects on specific geometry meshes. So a lot of this stuff was made possible by our senior rendering engineer, Daniel Wright, who added the feature to be able to render directly to a render target through Blueprint script. And it's something that there'd been a need for it for a long time, but it wasn't a high priority feature request on the engine side. And it was something Daniel just did kind of in between his other main tasks. And he was the one to kind of recognize the importance of it to technical artists. And prior to that, you had to do some hacky things like placing a scene capture in your scene, pointing it at a flat quad just to render the simple material, which was a bit wasteful, and you pay for some overhead of post-processing and things like that. So now you can literally just tell it to draw simple render targets and just kind of go from there. So in its most basic form, I mentioned that we do draw material directly to a render target. And what we're seeing here is an example where I have a blueprint node draw material to render target, to reiterate that for the 1000th time. And here we're baking down a material that has some expensive Voronoi noise. And so we actually do have a Voronoi noise node in the material editor now, but it's fairly expensive to use. But you can actually use it to pre-bake that into tiling textures and use them in interesting ways. And that's just kind of the beginning of how you can use this stuff. So taking it a little bit further than just basically copying your material to a render target, you can do things like controlled painting effects. And this way you usually do that is to create a material instance dynamic for your material that lets you drive things via parameters. So here I'm creating, in that little graph, a material instance dynamic, and just setting some properties of it, such as the hit location that I want to draw, how big it is, and then finally on the right is the node to actually do that render using those values. And notice it's the MID that's hooked up as the material there. And some typical things you might do to drive that painting is like converting user input to a local position inside of the render target. So typically when you're doing a simple render target without UVs or anything, you're dealing with a 0 to 1 range of your drawing. So you want to convert whatever painting action you're doing into that 0 to 1 space. This is just a quick example of a hard-coded transform where I do the hit location, which is what you would get potentially from a line trace result, where you have easy access to that world space. Doing an inverse transform into the actor transform of whatever you're trying to paint on is what handles the rotation and getting it centered. And then right after that, what I do is I divide by the object size, and then basically it's biascaling that result into the 0 to 1 range rather than, so that if it was in the very center, it would be 0.5 rather than 0. And there's a lot of different ways of handling that. That's just kind of a quick example. And I'm going to be jumping into the editor back and forth a little bit to show you guys some interactive versions of this, starting from simple again and kind of building up from there. So we're going to go ahead and jump to the editor for a second here. And this is starting with a basic example where we're just painting into a render target with some user definition. So you can see here I have a little render target, and I have kind of a cursor that's just moving a sphere around, and I can mouse wheel up and down and kind of paint, kind of drag this thing around. Not very exciting in and of itself, but this is all using that same sphere mask setup that I mentioned before, where we're just converting to a local position and then rendering. But it's not super interesting in and of itself. But we can just make one slight modification to this that can allow it to be pretty powerful. So instead, instead of painting just a white value, I'm going to paint velocity. And basically, the difference here is instead of just painting a white color, I'm painting the direction of the mouse, which is based on saving the previous location of my line trace. And then in the current frame, I get the difference between the previous location and the current location. And that's essentially all a velocity is. And what this is actually doing is painting a flow map. And so if I tell it to show the fluid here, it's the same render target under the hood. But I can do things like start to paint detailed rivers and control flow. So I go through here, and I can start to click and drag the fluid. And then usually when you're doing something like flow maps, you'd be using another program and have to bring it back and forth to figure out why it doesn't fit or why it's not lining up exactly. But you'll notice I can kind of just massage this fluid to do interesting things and create eddies over these kind of theoretical little pylons. And there's not a lot of complexity going on here. This is using the standard flow map material function inside of UE4. It's actually the flow map _ simple version. We have a couple different ones, but there's no need to use the more advanced versions. But it's really fun being able to do stuff like this directly in the editor, seeing it inside of the shader itself, where I can do some bizarre things like create little swirl vortices, pretty much anything you could want to try. Okay. I'm going to preload the next level here real quick, and then I'm going to switch back to the slides. We'll be going back and forth a couple of times throughout this. Okay. So the next thing that you can kind of do with this is you can even extend this simple two-dimensional painting up into what I call a pseudo-volume texture, where you can kind of imagine a volume texture is a laid-out flipbook where you have little 2D slices laid out, almost like a deck of cards, where instead of representing time for each frame, each sequential frame is another slice in the z dimension. And so that little green kind of holographic box you see there is representing the virtual slices in space. And you can see they're laid out in 2 dimensions next to each other. And I'm kind of highlighting in the actual flipbook which is the current rendered slice. And you can use that to encode 3-dimensional volume textures, which you can use for seamless noise that wraps around brick edges in your levels, which is a problem that always comes up when people are using world-aligned textures. And then in the bottom there, I'm using a material function called encode volume coordinates. And basically what that does is it lays out that coordinate system, which is that strange orange and pink box on the left, where it's simpler than it looks, I promise. Basically, each little frame there has the same 0 to 1 UV space that you would have on a standard quad. And the only thing that's changing is the Z position, which is why you see the blue go from non-existent slowly up to white. And it gives it kind of a normal mappy-like color in that final frame there. And so that encode volume coordinates function returns you that array of positions. And then you can do something just like you would do in 2 dimensions, like a sphere mask, to create a round shape. And on the animated GIF on the right there, you can actually see where those sphere mask slices lay out in the volume texture. And I'm doing things like scaling it around. And then to make it look like an actual cloud, the only addition there is to multiply one of our noise functions in the editor by that sphere mask. One minor thing that is actually not completely accurate on this slide, instead of the node sphere mask, if you use the node just distance between the volume coordinates and the center that you want to draw, and then you do a subtraction with the radius, that actually gives you a true distance field that doesn't basically clamp to 0 outside of the range of the sphere. It actually goes negative. And that allows you, when you add more noise, it'll actually grow the sphere just by changing the intensity of that noise, which is how you kind of see when I'm scaling the y-axis. And all I did there was kind of arbitrarily choose, hey, I have this transform gizmo in the editor that can move. What if I just put the scale of the sphere on the red axis, and then the intensity of the noise on the y-axis? Completely arbitrary decision that I made to be able to tweak that without having some number knobs off to the side. It's all just right there. And so it's actually a little bit tricky to paint 3D volume textures in 2 dimensions, as you can imagine. There's really not a lot out there that lets you do that. And in this example here, all I've done is take that same sphere mask noise painting example, and I'm driving the position of it with a blueprint using the motion controller from, in this case, the Vive that I have. And then I'm able to do things like paint and erode that volume texture. And I'm not going to go too much into the actual volume ray marching in this talk here because, for one, there's been a lot of really great talks already presented that do a really good job of describing this, such as the Guerrilla Games volumetric cloudscapes talks, which I think is excellent. And I've also done some writing about this on my blog at ShaderBits, kind of an overview of how to build your own ray marcher in Unreal. And so this is basically the combination of that simple sphere mask rendering with a volume preview, and then driving the location of the sphere mask with the HMD. And the only real difference here in this preview is that I'm rendering that green preview by just writing to the green channel and interpreting that as kind of lighting data during the ray march. So the next thing that I'd like to show you guys is how you can bring in the scene capture that I mentioned early on to do things like more advanced mesh-based interaction. There's a lot of different interaction or possibilities for this, like custom mesh painting, like if you were doing a VR spray painting app maybe, or character damage or wetness effects, or you could even potentially do things like spread fire around meshes that just work seamlessly. So to do that, the basic concept is we need to get a coordinate system for our mesh, and we do that by actually unwrapping the mesh using the vertex shader. And that first image on the left there is showing the local position of the mesh, and then the vertex shader is being basically just controlled by a scalar parameter that I'm ramping from 0 to 1. And you can see how the coordinates that are on the mesh itself are preserved throughout that. And the way that that's accomplished is by using, instead of just raw world position, we actually have some settings under world position when you place that node that will be either including or excluding shader offsets. And in this case, it's important to use excluding shader offsets because you want to know the world position of the mesh before you went and screwed it all up and made it flat. And then on the right is just the same thing, but with the sphere mask being done using that position. So you can see how the sphere mask result on the object gets kind of translated into that UV space. And this forms the basis of how HitMasking type characters are done, where you want to accumulate a lot of damage on your character and have it be accurately represented based on where the animation pose is at each frame, rather than being restricted to just the T-pose positional data, and also without having to perform these sphere masks dynamically, because then you get into a bad situation of, oh, do I have to actually store all these hit locations and do the sphere mask on the character shader? And yes, while you could, it's not a very extensible way to do it. So much better is to actually accumulate that damage into the texture, and then once it's done, it's just a texture, and you can do a lot more with it. And so this is showing the positional UV unwrap material. And the basic idea here is we take, first of all, it requires unique light map type UVs for your mesh. And we start by taking that UV1 channel here in this case, and we use the constant bias scale node to scale it into the -1 to 1 range. And then we also multiply it by some arbitrary user-defined size, which is just going to match the size of your orthographic scene capture actor. And you basically want to fill that up so that you know that every pixel or texel inside your UV layout actually corresponds to the same location once it's been captured and then read back inside of the material with that same UV coordinate. And the final step is to neutralize the verts of the mesh, which is basically just subtracting the original world position, which you can think of as collapsing everything to an infinitely tiny point, which allows, when you add back the reprojection of the UVs, to position it back out as a flat UV unwrap shaped like the UVs. And you're not limited to doing simple things like just a sphere mask to accumulate these effects. In this example here, I'm actually doing a custom decal style projection with allowing actual FOV in degrees to be specified. And while this might be overkill for simple effects, you might want to have a very detailed splatter pattern potentially. And the basic idea there is we do a inverse transform, which is very similar to how I showed converting a hit position into local space in a previous slide. And the way you do that is you want to pass in some parameters for the transform. Basically, you would have an X transform for the direction going forward into your projection that you're doing, potentially the path that a projectile tracked. And then the X and Y, the Y and the Z can usually be derived, and you really only need to do one of them, and you can derive the other one with a cross product. And that would basically give you the rotation around that point, if that makes sense. And this is showing world position behind translucency here, if you notice in the very top left of that material graph, which allows it to basically work as a translucent effect for previewing purposes. But if you were doing it inside of the rendering unwrap material, you could just use the actual position stored in the positional unwrap texture. And then there's some math there to do the FOV, which is basically just scaling out the XY coordinates based on a little bit of tangent math. So to build a dynamic character HitMask effect, the basic steps that we need to do are, on damage, we capture a unwrap layout. So we assign the unwrapped material to our character, whichever character that happens to be, and then we have an event on our scene capture component, which is basically just capture. And the other thing to remember there is you want to make sure if you have this scene capture in the scene for that purpose that you uncheck the boxes for update on movement and update every frame, because otherwise you're wasting a lot of resources capturing when there's no damage occurring, which is a bit wasteful. And so after you've captured that, you tell it to restore the original material to that mesh, and then finally you can do the final step of accumulating the damage. So here I'm again telling it what position was hit using the material instance dynamic and the line trace result from the blueprint, and then the same old, our friend, draw material to render target. And this will actually perform the render itself. So now I'm going to switch back over to the editor. I have a little fun example to show. All right, there it is. I'm going to go ahead and play. So I have my little character blueprint here, which you can see all it is a skeletal mesh and a scene capture component 2D, which is set to not update every frame or on movement. So then when I go ahead and play this game, I have a simple pawn that all it's doing is line tracing. And if it detects that the pawn was of the type of this HitMask blueprint, it tells it to do damage. So basically, I can click anywhere on this character, and I can start to kind of apply a damage shader. And notice it'll even work on his hands based on where they are in the pose. And here I'm also doing just a little test of trying to show the damage in 3 dimensions by using the vertex shader of the mesh to apply a little bit of indentation. And in most places, this ends up working without further tweaks, but you might notice that the hands do get a little bit messed up because the offset is thicker than the fingers are wide. And you probably would supplement that with some sort of thickness mask where you say, OK, only apply some of this deformation to the hands, but allow more on the chest plate and the legs where there's a thicker amount of surface to subtract from. So you can see I could actually end up painting this entire character, and you'll start to see a lot more green accumulating into this render target. So I can stop this at this point, and we can see I kind of gave him a good tan. The backside is almost undamaged. I'd kind of like to make the point that while doing this render target stuff does let you prototype and build effects without having a rendering engineer, you still would want to at some point consult any graphics engineers on your product before you just go ahead and slip this into your game, and then they realize, oh wait, you didn't do that in the right way. You have every single character has its own scene capture or something like that. So while it does empower you to do a lot of custom effects, you still want to communicate and check with rendering guys before you go crazy and start putting everything as a render target in your game. So the next thing I want to show, going back over to these slides, OK, good, is how you can do some custom content creation inside of the editor using these same render target tricks. And I'm going to give an overview of some caustics rendering techniques. So before jumping in to actually show how that works in this case, I'm just going to give a basic overview of what is the difference between scatter and gather in rendering. And you've probably heard those terms before, like is that a scatter or gather technique? And just to sum it up quickly, with scattering, you're basically writing to many locations from one location, which you can visualize on the left there. Like say we're looking at this green pixel or texel in our texture, and we want to take that information and push it to other texels and write them everywhere. Whereas gather is the inverse of that, where say we're evaluating the stack of blue pixels in the center, and we've taken information from neighbors, which are those green ones with the arrows pointing to that one, and we've essentially read data from here, 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 and it all accumulates into that pixel that we're reading. And gather is probably a lot more typical when you're talking about standard shader programming. And to think about why, you just kind of have to imagine a little bit about the way that GPUs work when they're processing shaders. You can almost think of it as each little pixel on your material is its own little CPU, for the most part, that runs independently. So you have some inputs that say, OK, take maybe this texture, this coordinate, and write it down. But you never really have the ability to say, OK, take this pixel and write it over here. Instead, what you would do if you were doing something like blurring is you know I'm reading this pixel, and I'm going to write this pixel. But during that stage, I can also read my neighbor pixels and average out their values, and that's what the blurring is. So it's just kind of a backwards way of thinking about it versus doing scattering, which sometimes makes it a little bit tricky to communicate these ideas. And I'll try to be more clear on which is which throughout the rest of this. So getting back to caustics a little bit, just to give a quick overview of why do caustics form, what are they? They look neat. But to understand them, you have to understand a little bit about refraction. And refraction is really the only reason caustics exist. So I've drawn a silly graph here where we have a blue wave being repeated, and then we have a uniform pattern of light rays from a sun that's at 12 o'clock shooting down, and then the green lines are the direction that that light gets refracted. And basically refraction says when light hits a surface, it gets bent in the direction of the negative normal of that surface. So you can see where the light is hitting the steep part of the wave crest, it gets bent over there. And then you also might notice that the area underneath that little wave crest gets two areas with photons that hit the area directly underneath it. Whereas the areas underneath the center of each wave trough, they are actually a little bit defocused because those lines are getting spread out. And so you hear about that a lot in caustics, the focusing and defocusing effect, which really is a lensing type effect. And that's really what makes those bright lines and dark spots. And of course, I've shown it here at just the right depth where those lines converge, but the deeper that your water goes, you're actually going to get more chaotic and much more overlap in those lines. And you actually see the overlap here with those caustic lines crossing, where it's actually the photons went so far they crossed each other. So refraction is basically obeys Snell's law of refraction, which basically you don't have to fully understand the math of this to take anything away from this, but the refraction is based on the ratio of the refractive indices of the two media. And so for the air-water interface, which is what we're primarily going to talk about here, you can just go ahead and use the first refractive index of the air is 1, because that's how they've normalized the math for this stuff. And then for water, it's 1.3 repeating, I believe. But you don't have to be that accurate with it. And the ratio of N1 over N2 is 0.75. So you could basically say that the angle of the refracted light is, the sine of the angle of the refracted light is just 0.75 times the sine of the angle of the incident light, or the incoming light. So on the left, that's showing how this is basically just some simple Pythagorean theorem math that everyone should have learned in grade school probably, but if not, give yourself a quick refresher on it. It's not too complicated. One minor correction that I would like to make here that I just realized is on the upper triangle on the left, I drew the sine on the wrong side. It should be flipped to be the above part of the triangle, because the incident angle is actually defined by vertical is a 0 angle, whereas rotating down goes to a 90-degree angle. And then on the right is just a debug visualization, which thankfully actually shows it more correctly, of based on incoming light, you have certain angles of refraction. And one thing that I would like you guys to remember from this part here is even when light comes in at almost a perfect 90-degree angle, it will never be refracted below the surface at anything greater than what is known as the critical angle. And that turns out to be 48.6. And we're going to use that in a little bit for an optimization. So in terms of doing the refraction math, there's a lot of different methods out there that are basically derivations of that Pythagorean theorem math in vector form using things like cross products. And probably the fastest accurate method I've seen is called Heckerbert's method, which at the reference slide at the end of this will give you guys a link to a paper on that. However, I'm going to use a much simpler, fairly accurate approximation, which has been found in some literature for a while, which is basically just to blend the incident light ray with the negative normal based on some user-defined parameters. And I've actually found a few tweaks to this formula to reduce the error to within about ½ a degree at its maximum. And so this graph on the right is the same one as before, where the fat blue line is actually the correct Heckerbert's method of the refraction, so it's the true ground truth, and then the thin blue line within that is actually this approximation. So you can see it never even wanders outside of that fat line. And the reason that I've included that simplified math here is because it's much less intimidating, it's much easier to copy. And then these two magic numbers you see there, the 0.225 and 465, those are magic numbers arrived at by experimentation that fit only the air-water interface. So presumably you could also find equally good magical numbers for any other type of refraction. Maybe you want to do a diamond. And you could use a debug shader like this to help you tweak those numbers and make sure that the error is kind of never exceeding too much, because it really will affect the results of the caustics in a bad way if you use a poor approximation. And just really quick, the reason that this approximation is usually used in real-time games historically without this extra correction is because in games we can't afford to do correct refraction most of the time. We're typically doing refraction in screen space, which means the ray of light can't ever leave the screen. Otherwise, you're going to either see stretching, or you're going to see black, or you'll see nothing. So typically, we're actually using refraction values that have a much lower magnitude than they would have with correct refraction. So basically, there hasn't been a lot of effort or focus on getting correct refraction for that very reason, unless you're doing something like this, where you're going to use it for content creation rather than doing it completely in real time using the actual scene. The alternative where that's not the case is if you're actually doing your refraction into a cube map, where you can afford to look it up just about anywhere because you have access to the whole cube map from all 360 degrees. So I'm going to jump back over to the editor real quick. Before I mentioned the scatter method versus the gather method, so first it makes sense to consider a scatter method of this because it's a little bit more intuitive, and it's actually previewable in real time. And so the way that this is actually working, I'm going to take this blueprint I have here and first set the depth to 0 so there's no refraction. And I'm going to basically show up close what's going on here. So this is a static mesh that is basically a 512 by 512 grid of polygons, basically a stack of cards. So I guess 512 by 512, what is that, 262,000 quads, where they're laid out in a two-dimensional grid. And because we have a primitive for each, essentially, photon, we can use a vertex shader to push them and offset them to where they need to go, using that same refraction math from before. And this is in contrast to the gather method, where you actually have to find where something might have come from. It's not the most fast or efficient way, but again, we're probably going to use this to bake to a static texture or a Flipbook animation. So you can tell right away, caustics require a ton of photons, even when they're not doing any refraction. You either need a lot of photons or you need each photon to be fairly big, at which point you lose resolution. So now when I'm looking at that, I can actually select this water blueprint and change the depth. And you can really see the caustics in action, where each photon is being moved around. And you can actually visualize those overlap lines that I talked about before. And so I mentioned it requires a lot of density to make caustics look good. So right here is showing the 512 by 512 grid of photons. I can actually place many instances of that one mesh to start to fill in those holes. So here I'm doing 4 divisions, and I believe this is the same as using around 16 million quads, and that's finally enough to have no more gaps in our photons. And the reason why you need so many and why we don't have a pre-integrated caustic solution in light mass is because of that crazy amount of oversampling that is required, particularly in the regions of defocus, which would be the dark spots between the bright lines. But because this is a scatter method and not a gather method, I can do cool things, like I can simulate and just see the animation of that caustics in real time. Or in addition, I can select this blueprint, which is a Gerstner wave implementation, which I'm not going to go too much into Gerstner waves because, again, there's been a lot of really great work published and written about this at GDC already. Most of it comes from the research published by Dr. Jerry Tessendorf, who at Epic we were lucky enough to have him visit us last year, and we've started a bit of a relationship going forward talking about these sort of researchy projects. But we can basically change the spectrum of our Gerstner wave shader, and by changing the things like the wavelength, we can start to kind of narrow in on what's the best type of caustics that we want to create. And here I'm actually supplementing it with a detail normal map, which I'll turn that off real quick. So now we're looking at just the caustics of the water surface. So by changing the wave pattern, I can see that right away. And I can go back and, again, tweak the depth, which is probably the more interesting thing to change, because you start to see, and ignoring that little bit of aliasing pattern we're seeing there because we're using individual polygons for each photon, we can see the increased chaos with depth. And you can also start to notice that with increased depth, you have to have even more samples, or you're going to see the gaps between the photons once again. So the scatter method, even though it's very fun to play with and it's real time in a sense, it's also not something you would put inside of your game because you don't want to have 16 million polygons just for an effect like that. So going back to gather methods, Let's check my slide. You can be a lot more flexible, and you can do things like rendering, again, caustics to a specific mesh, which means you're not just bound to doing a tiling texture anymore. So I'm actually going to jump over to the slides again real quick before showing that. Just give it 1 second. Can we switch back to the PowerPoint slides, guys? Sorry, that was my mistake. Is it not? Oh, it is, sorry. OK, so building a gather renderer. Essentially what you have to do is similar to that HitMask damaging where we showed before, where you have your entire render target of all the positions on the character, and they're all essentially doing a sphere mask with the position that you say you hit. So they're all saying, OK, am I near there? Yes, no, or no. And they're all getting that result. You could think of caustics gathering is you're shooting those rays as individual photons down into your water, but you don't know how far they may travel or where they may end up. So you have every part of your texture doing that search for that location. And my approach to doing that was to set up a search algorithm that will basically iterate over all pixels in the texture, where every pixel searches every other pixel. And then you run that until everything has been searched. And again, it requires a lot of oversampling, especially with increased water depth. And so my approach to this initially was basically to build a scanline renderer. And each render target draw, all texels in your render target are reading a single source location where light essentially hit the water and then could have been refracted, for all we know, anywhere at this point. And the brute force approach is to go through all of the texels, and you can tell it to render a certain number of times per frame to try to speed that up, although there's a pretty lower bound on how much that helps, because obviously once you start telling the GPU to do too much work, the frame rate will just drop, and you're just seeing the same thing at a lower frame rate, but the same amount of work is getting done. And in case you guys are thinking, oh, what is he talking about? What is this crazy scanline thing? I have a little image on the next slide that kind of equates this to a classical cartoon example. You can think of it as basically eating corn on the cob, where we have those little red dots being shown there are basically showing, going through all those texels, and it's compositing them one at a time. And I've slowed this down considerably here to show this, because with this level of undersampling, it goes by pretty quick. But this approach doesn't really scale, because the more photons you add, like to do a 4K render at this, it was taking about 1 hour to do an animation. And that's obviously why even use Unreal to do that if that's what you're getting. So to speed that up, we can actually take advantage of GPU parallelism. And it sounds like a big, lofty concept, but it turns out it's something you can implement, once again, just using simple material nodes and tricks. So to implement that, we first need to ask and think a little bit about what the problem we're trying to solve is. So again, we're talking about, we have, like the HitMask example, we shot some damage at our water, but we don't know where it might end up. So we end up just searching everything because we don't know anything. But remember before I talked about the critical angle. The refraction is never going to allow that photon to travel more than a certain angle. Although I'd like to point out, this does assume that light is coming down from a 12 o'clock straight down, because otherwise you end up in a situation where the light came in sideways and it hit an almost sideways wave, and then it could essentially travel almost infinitely far. It turns out to not really be that big of a limitation, because people can't really tell what the angle of the light is based on the caustics, or it's not something they expect to see variation in anyways. So we take advantage of that critical angle, and we use that to tell ourselves that when we're checking texels in our texture that we're rendering to, we know they must have originated within a certain search grid based on the sine of 41, which is just 90 minus the critical angle, times the water's depth. And so you can see if we were searching that red texel, which is representing the ocean floor and also the texel in our render target that we're trying to find, we know we only have to search everything along that yellow line at the bottom. Because even where the light hit the very vertical part of that wave crest, it still couldn't go further than that distance. So what this ends up looking like, going back to our goofy cartoon example, was our 4K texture is like a piece of corn that's way too long. So obviously, instead of trying to eat it faster, what if you just chopped it up into small pieces and gave it to a lot of people? And each one is able to just eat their little part of the corn. So this may seem a little bit silly, but when we look at the next animation slide, it actually ends up being a pretty good example. So this is the same thing as before, but we broke up the search grid into modular little chunks, where each red dot only has to travel the distance of one of those grid cells. And we do that because we know, again, you are going to find the right answer somewhere within that cell. we do move the search grid so that it's always centered around the red dot. And again, the red dot always moves the entire width of that box. And this speed up from this is actually squared. So in this case, I did 8 subdivisions, which means it renders 64 times faster. So that means I'm able to do things like before it was taking an hour to render a sub-UV animation of this down to about a minute for getting a full 64-frame animation, which is great. So I mentioned before, you're probably not going to do this in real time in your game for hopefully obvious reasons. So the obvious solution is to store it in a Flipbook and to make it loop, just using a simple trick that's pretty common with this sort of techniques, is to, at the end of your animation, you actually start blending to a phase that is offset by one whole animation length in time. So as we basically get from A to B, once we get over past the halfway point, what we're actually doing to, instead of lerping to B, is we're lerping to some time that was back before A. And to composite that into an atlas, it's just some simple one-dimensional to 2D coordinate conversion, which I've shown the math there. It's basically, to give a simple example, let's say we were doing a 4x4 layout of sub-UV. We know that that's 16 frames, because 4x4 is 16. So we would just do a for loop that's 16 things long, and we have the one-dimensional index, which is the current loop index. And we just need to convert that into a 2D position. And the math for that is that the x position is the one-dimensional index mod the number of x frames, and the y coordinate is just the one-dimensional index divided by the number of x frames. And we have I've created some blueprint little macro libraries that will probably be released at some point in the near future in a content plugin, just to share some of this with you guys, so you don't have to create everything back from the ground up. But there's no reason you can't just do that in a few minutes as well. So doing this sort of parallelization stuff kind of led to some interesting little accidental discoveries, which one was, if you simply don't let the render finish, or you tell it to stop after a certain number of texels that's less than the actual number, it ends up creating a whole bunch of these little trails like that. Which they end up looking like cool volumetric wispy things, which you could presumably use in things like splines or animation trails or ribbons for Cascade. I haven't really had time to go through and actually make some better examples for that, but I'm kind of curious to see what people can come up with, because it looks a lot like some of the wispy volumetric stuff I see a lot of my coworkers doing in third-party programs. So the next step to making this look a little bit more interesting was to do chromatic aberration. So for a while, the standard to do this has just been the simple RGB offset, which is basically, it's how the chromatic aberration, or scene fringe, as we call it in UE4 post-processing, is done, where you just do 3 lookups of your scene texture, each one with a little bit of an offset. And while that's very fast and works in real time, it also has some betraying artifacts. Like you might notice that there are 3 distinct sharp ghost images, rather than a nice continuously connected light spectrum between that refraction. So my approach to solving that in a better way was actually to, instead of rendering a perfect dot for each photon of light, I instead render a line, and I create a pre-integrated spectral texture that allows the color of that line to be based on the spread. And so on these first 3 slides on the left, that's basically just showing the action of that texture, where we have a white photon that progressively spreads out and shows that it's actually made up of a full spectrum of color. And then the next 2 are just beams of light that have essentially been focused and defocused to varying degrees. And you start to see some very matching photos type of chromatic aberration, where at low levels you get just the orange and blue, and finally you eventually see the greens and the violets as the spread gets wide enough. The one on the right is actually what the pre-integrated lookup texture looks like. And the way this is looked up in the shader is that the x-axis is simply read along the length of the line. And so any one photon is only looking at a single y-coordinate within that slice, but it's always mapping the entire width of the texture. And we use the stretching or width of that photon to map the y-coordinate. And kind of a weird effect that I noticed was this created kind of an X-cross shape, which showed that something similar to in soft shadowing, you have something called an antumbra and a penumbra, where the shadow is either fully opaque or starting to have variations of gray between full and partial shadow. Something similar happens with light spectrum, which I didn't quite expect, but it makes sense when you think about the way that that works. So now I'm going to go back into the editor and show this gathering to an actual mesh. I'm just going to show the tiling texture one really quickly, which is basically what you saw in that video, where when I hit simulate, you go ahead and see that thing go down one thing at a time. And I can, again, it's not as fun to tweak this one because you actually will have to tweak some parameters. But for example, I can say only 512 sample res. What does that look like? Oh, and I've created that same recognizable cornrow artifact. So I'm just going to jump into a more interesting example, where this is basically a mixture of the different techniques. Give me 1 second. I forgot that rendering in the other map, it uses the same render target. So we're actually looking at that previous caustic pattern on this mesh. But I can actually go down. Let me tell it to render on mesh. And I'm using the same tricks, kind of the combination of everything in this talk up to this point, where unwrapping the UV layout of the mesh and then performing the same sort of HitMask type math to find that source photon. And the same optimization of splitting up the grid works here as well. And so this is showing in action the compositing of the sub-UV frames. And then it's actually computing a bounce sliding pass again at the very end, which I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, other than to say that it again uses something similar where you're just checking for where bounce slide could have come from within some range that you specify. And now that that's done rendering, I can uncheck the preview option, and I can go ahead and move my water surface over here. And now we have an accurate caustic pattern that actually matches this water above this pool. And in addition, I'm using some tricks to actually get volumetric caustic beams without actually doing any extra work, which sounds a bit crazy. But that was another kind of accidental discovery. So I mentioned before this is using the UV layout. And when I did the UV layout of this pool mesh, I realized, oh, wow, there's a lot of empty space in here that I just can't fill up without having one UV chart bigger than the rest, which is something you always want to avoid. So I thought, OK, I can just fill that extra space with a bunch of cross-plane geometry, just kind of arbitrarily. And that's what you see with these kind of little chunks of repeated flat bottoms here. It's literally a bunch of cross planes, and then those are just reading back the same caustic texture from the mesh itself. And it creates a pretty nice effect where you can actually see the hot spots that match. And we can even go under the water and start to look up and see some nice caustic patterns kind of forming. All right. So going back over to our PowerPoint real quick. So what I've been talking about mostly so far are ways of making things like tiling textures, which they can, or animated textures, which can be either tiling or they can be baked to a mesh. But it's becoming more common in games as well to have a little bit of actual fluid simulation, such as a ripple solver, which creates nice little water ripples, maybe character footsteps or damage impacts. And that's showing a little image there. And you might run into the same problem I did of how do I mix this nice pre-rendered sub-UV animation of caustics with some other information you have, such as the normal map of your fluid sim. So I use a technique that's a little bit based off of some of the work that Pixar's done in the past to estimate caustics without actually doing any photon gathering, which is to take an offset sample of the normal map of our ripples and just read the difference between the blue channel of those two normal maps. And that gives you an approximation of the focus lines, or the bright spots underneath the ripples. And then combining that with another kind of trick, which this was actually something that one of the other technical artists, Jordan Walker, suggested to me as he saw me playing with it. And I thought, oh, yeah, I kind of thought about that and forgot about it. And he kind of reignited it in me, which is to use the XY value of the normal map to do a slight UV distortion of the tiling caustics. And when you mix those two things together, you get a fairly convincing result where the tiling caustics underneath get kind of warped inside of the pattern of the ripples, and then you create some bright lines from the blue channel of that normal map as well. And so this is kind of what that looks like in action. So on the very left, that's a tiling sub-UV caustic snapshot rendered from this blueprint over here. And then the center frame is actually the normal map of some ripple solver. And I'm not going to go too much into ripple solvers here today, other than to say, if you download the latest content examples project for the Unreal Engine in the marketplace, there's actually a map called Fluid Simulation Test or Fluid Sim something like that, that has a ripple solver that you can play with, and it basically will create a normal map just like that there. And then combining them, you get, not a completely accurate, but a somewhat cool-looking and convincing mixture of the pre-rendered caustics with something dynamic that's happening based on the user interaction. And again, it's just a simple one sample offset of that normal map with a blue channel. And so next, I'm going to go into actually building some fluid simulation inside of the editor using blueprints and render targets again. And so when people say fluid simulation, it's kind of, again, it's a very wide term that means a lot of things to different people. Probably in games, what's traditionally been meant by fluid simulation is ripple solvers, which again is that content example that we have. And one of our technical writers, Sam Dieter, is giving a talk over at the booth showing how to manipulate ripple solvers and do neat effects like rain. And it's also going to have the same sort of caustic stuff inside of it. If you want to see that in better action, it's over at the Unreal Engine booth running every day. I sadly do not know the time, but it should be pretty easy to get that. What I'm going to be showing in this presentation today is more of a velocity advection type simulation. And that's what people are talking about when they say things like Navier-Stokes simulation, where you're actually doing more tracking velocities and spreading something like density or fluid around, or even temperature causing buoyancy. And that effect on the right is a little animation that was actually made, again, using a blueprint that we'll work our way up to by the end of this. So fluid simulation, I'm sure a lot of you guys are probably familiar with the term flow maps. I guess anyone want to nod and agree or disagree? Is that something you guys are familiar? OK. So flow maps is basically showing a version of fluid simulation without actually doing simulation by storing velocities that are artistically created, such as the example before where I was making the little river with the pylons. And what they do is they distort the texture coordinates using that velocity map. But they build up a lot of stretching if you just let that distortion increase over time. And they hide that stretching by essentially leapfrogging between two phases. And I probably should have had an image for this in here, but it's basically like two sine waves of alternating phases where they blend to each other. So it resets the amount of stretching at each frame to restart. And we can think about that stretching that builds up that flow maps try to hide as being something called divergence. And for right now, all I want you guys to remember is that divergence is bad. And typically, fluids in real life have very low or zero divergence. And what that means is that the flow is at equilibrium at any one point in our fluid. And so going back to thinking about things like textures, we think about fluids as being limited to individual cells, which are texels in our texture. And so how do we measure divergence? What does that mean? It's basically just the measure of how much fluid enters versus leaves each cell. So the cell on the left, say we have a pixel, and the neighbors away all say that fluid is leaving that cell. It's going up, it's going down, it's going left, it's going right. Now the question is, where does the flow come to replenish that lost fluid? And the answer is nowhere. So it ends up creating some pretty bad artifacts. And on the cell on the right, we have a slightly different situation where fluid is going up and down, but then it's coming back in from the sides. And as long as the magnitude of all those arrows or vectors adds up to where it balances out to 0, where in this case I tried to draw them the same length, but I probably messed that up a little bit, there will be very low or no divergence. And stable fluids ideally have no divergence, which means they're at equilibrium. And that's not necessarily entirely true, because if you set off a bomb underneath the water, there will be a momentary pressure wave. But in most cases, when you talk about fluid simulations in real time, you're ignoring all of that pressure math, and you just want to reach a state of equilibrium as quickly as possible. So the basic steps to perform a Navier-Stokes fluid sim is first, oh, look, they're all first. Great. So there's only one step, guys. You can just go home now. The first step is advection, which, again, is just like the step from flow maps, where you just distort the texture coordinates a little bit. The second step is to calculate the divergence. The third step is to solve the pressure equations, which if you think about it like, if you think about the divergence, if there's a lot of divergence, it's basically saying there's a lot of pressure between these two cells. And then the final step is to subtract that pressure gradient from the velocity field, which in theory, after you've done that step, now you have a new velocity field with very low or zero divergence. And it's worth noting we never actually reach zero divergence in these methods because we're using an iterative method. And of course, we can never afford to run enough iterations. We want to keep them as low as possible. And so I've drawn out an actual, not drawn, it's actually a screenshot from the blueprint that we'll be using here, showing how those steps of the fluid sim each are just a simple function in Blueprint where I've kind of wrapped the draw material to render target node with just a couple controls for saying which render target to draw to and which one to read from. Like in the beginning, advect, then divergence, and notice that At the end of advect, we return the advected velocity texture. For divergence, we read the advected velocity texture, but we're writing to a divergence texture. And then in the next step, for the pressure iterations, we're writing to a pressure texture, and we're using the divergence texture from the previous step. So at each step, we're kind of chaining together these render targets. And then finally, the last step of gradient subtraction, we read the advected velocity texture again, which is from the first step, and then we give it the pressure texture, and then we give it the original velocity texture at the very bottom right there, which if you go back to the start of the graph on the left, you'll see that velocity texture is the very first render target there. So that's what brings us full circle. We've now corrected our velocity texture with advection and hopefully no divergence, and we can do the next step of the simulation. So each frame would call that same sequence of events over and over again. So advection, hopefully I'm not going too much into something you guys already understand here with flow maps. We basically use a velocity texture to distort UV coordinates like flow maps. And this is called a semi-Lagrangian method of velocity tracking. And what does that mean exactly? Well, Lagrangian advection is where you have something like particles, and you're explicitly storing and modifying the position of the particles at each frame. What makes this in the semi-Lagrangian is that at the end of each frame, we revert to just a uniform grid of texels, and that's just kind of a limitation of doing this using a texture rather than with particles. But it turns out that it doesn't really affect the result. It's still what we call in fluids unconditionally stable. And the reason why is because when we do that distortion, we're actually reading from a value that has been bilinear filtered. So it's actually already kind of taking into account the weighting of how close that sample was to this vertex or this pixel versus the neighboring pixel. It's not just getting the center of each texel, which would lead to some pretty bad artifacts. And again, hitting on the whole point of scatter versus gather, doing this in texture and in shaders means that we pretty much have to use gather methods. So instead of saying, OK, this velocity causes this pixel to move forward, we take a step backwards in time. So we're reading in here the center texel. And if the velocity said to go forward, we would actually then go backwards, which is just multiplying it by -1 or subtracting it instead of adding it. And then we read the velocity from there, and then we write that to the current cell that we're evaluating. So here, like the green cell at the center of that little grid on the left says to take a step backwards in time and read the value from that orange cell, which then in the next frame, you can see the orange cell has been written to be that center frame to replace it. And this is just showing the basic concept of, this is an actual screenshot from the advection that I'm using in the example up next, which shows we have some velocity texture, and we subtract a portion of it from our UVs. And then we use that to look up whatever texture it is that we're saying that we're advecting, which it could either be the velocity texture, or it's also very common to duplicate the advection step with a different texture, which we usually a color map of some kind, just because there's usually not enough channels in one texture to do all of the cool effects that we may want to end up doing. And one other thing to note, I multiply the velocity by time step, which is pretty standard to allow you to tweak how much stuff happens per frame, either using blueprints or materials. And then also, it gets multiplied by the inverse of the texture resolution. And that's important to take note of because when you normalize your velocities to say that a value of 1.0 equals moving 1 texel, it simplifies a ton of the math in the fluid simulation, where you'll usually see things like delta x squared underneath things as a divisor. But if x is just 1, that's 1 squared is 1, dividing by 1 is nothing. So it simplifies a lot of the equations. So it's a good idea. But it does mean that you want to use HDR render targets, which take a little bit more memory, but it's a good idea anyways, because 8 bits really isn't enough precision to get much interesting flow in your simulation. So divergence, I mentioned before, it's just a measure of inflow versus outflow at each cell. And calculating it is pretty simple. Again, I'm going to be using this little 4 neighbor grid diagram to explain a lot of things. Say we have the center texel, which is the blue one. The divergence is basically the x component of the left cell minus the x component of the right cell plus the y component of the top cell minus the y component of the bottom cell, which said, in a better simple English terminology, we figure out how much fluid's flowing this way, and we figure out how much fluid's flowing this way, and we just add those up. And if they equal 0, we have no divergence, but typically there'll always be some slight non-zero component. Or in this case here, I have a screenshot from a blueprint I created to test divergence of various functions, where this is a preview slice of the gradient of Perlin noise, which is not an ideal field to use for velocities because it's highly divergent, as we can see there. Every little bit of gray clumping that we see is actually divergence. The next step I mentioned before was to solve the pressure equations, which is basically if we had a lot of really, say you moved a ball of water or a ball underwater really fast, you would get a momentary buildup of a little bit of pressure, and that would actually push some of the particles forward. And the reason why it's important to solve that inside of our fluid simulation is because of the gather method, we are taking a backward step in time. And if you think about, we have this, say we have our ball that's moving underwater, it has a velocity that's pretty hard-edged, and the pixel right in front of it, say, has a velocity of 0, so it reads back. And when you say take a backward step of 0, it can never leave its initial boundary, which means the fluid will be kind of bound by its initial boundary where the velocity was 0 in the seed velocity. So you need to kind of solve that pressure equation to allow the pressure to propagate and allow the velocity to kind of move forward to new areas where the backward step in time will not pick up on it. So there's a lot of different methods of doing these iterations. The most common one, which we'll be using here today, is Jacobi iterations. And there are more optimized methods, such as multi-grid or successive over-relaxation. Multi-grid is a pretty simple concept where you do these iterations at a lower downsampled render target, and then you perform just a couple iterations at your final resolution. And that means you take less iterations because each jump of a Navier pixel is going much further. And that really helps out, but I have not had time to implement that just yet. Successive over-relaxation is a lot more complicated, but there's nothing mutually exclusive about these. They can all be kind of combined in unique and novel ways that there's room for new research and improvements beyond what's out there right now. So I'm going to show the Jacobi iteration method, which I've, again, used my handy little 4-neighbor diagram here. And this is showing the actual math to calculate the Jacobi iteration, one iteration inside the shader. So before we do our pressure iterations, we already have our divergence value, which is just a scalar field, which means it's just a black and white value. And we have our pressure field, which at the start of each iteration is typically 0. And by iterating over this, what we do is we sample the pressure texture at offsets of 1 pixel. We add up the 4 neighbors, and then we subtract the center divergence value. And then we divide by the number of neighbors, which in this case is just 4. So really that's showing the 4 blue squares minus the red square divided by 4 is what it ends up being. And what this does is it creates kind of a guess at each point for, does this pressure across these pixels satisfy the divergence that we know we've calculated? And at each iteration, the guess gets a little bit better. And the final step is to subtract the pressure gradient. And this step is pretty simple. It's basically kind of like computing a normal map, where you take an offset left and right sample and an offset top and bottom sample. And you just convert that into a float 2, where the x component is the right minus the left, the y component is the top minus the bottom. And that's pretty much all there is to that. And then subtracting the pressure gradient is so simple that you just take the velocity texture and you subtract this result that I've shown here in the material. And you can add a lot of neat effects in various ways, such as temperature buoyancy, which is probably the most common one that people like to add to their simulation to play with it. And since this is only a 2-dimensional simulation at this point, we're not doing anything with the blue channel. So of course, we can just use our blueprint to write a little bit of blue channel data. And the way that that actually ends up acting as buoyancy is at each iteration inside of the advection material, although of course you could break this out to be a separate step, but I tended to start just adding more things into my advection material because I could, and I didn't want to keep on changing the blueprint at every time I did something. At each advection step, I read some of the blue channel, I multiply it by a vector, which in this case was red because the way that I placed my mesh in the world and my camera, the red was up, but it probably should have been y. And then we add that back to the velocity field at each frame. So it's basically saying this temperature here turns it into some velocity. And then for rendering that in our final display material, we use the black body function, which is just a node inside of the UE4 material editor. And it's also callable in the custom node simply as just black body parentheses x. And what that does is it creates a nice color ramp from your scalar black and white field that goes from those nice dark orange values up to white and eventually blue for super bright. So now I'm going to jump back into the editor mode and just show kind of playing with one of these simple simulations. So here I have seeded a color texture with just a rainbow, and I can do things like drag around and see temperature buoyancy affecting this fluid simulation. And I can start to mix the colors in interesting ways. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm also going to open up this blueprint and kind of show how I have different seed materials, such as the color seed material is literally just this random rainbow texture I found inside of the engine. But it could be set to be anything. But I can actually set temperature to 0, just to get an idea of what do these velocities themselves do. And you get these interesting little mixing, like you're swirling in a crazy paint can or something like that. And right now, I'm actually doing a lot of iterations. This is with 400 iterations. But you can see I can lower that to things, if I lower it to 20, it's still interesting, but it's not as good. You'll start to see the fluid hit the boundary of where it initially was. So generally, using something like a multi-grid technique to expand this would allow even less iterations to look as good. At some point, I could enter 1,000, and that's probably, you're going to notice the frame rate's a little bit dropped. But now we have even more detail in our turbulence in our simulation. One thing that I'm not doing here in this example that I should have done is to, instead of resetting the velocity, the pressure to be 0 at the beginning of each iteration, a trick that our same rendering engineer, Daniel Wright, who added the render target feature, told me about, was you can just leave the pressure guess from the end of the last iteration because it's still going to be closer than 0 because your time steps are pretty low usually, and the velocity doesn't change all that much between frames. So if you just don't reset that pressure texture to 0, you might get actually a much better result with much fewer iterations. And then combining that with things like the multi-grid technique, it should be possible to get the number of iterations way down and get the performance up. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about expanding this to 3D simulation. And I know when I first started looking into 3D simulation, it was very intimidating, and I thought, oh, wow, this is going to be 10 times harder than doing a 2D simulation. But it turned out that wasn't really the case. The only thing that really made it hard was that a lot of the papers I was reading were kind of hidden behind math walls of giant integrals and crazy little derivative signs and stuff. And a lot of that was basically meaningless, just boilerplate, like replacing velocity to be normalized to 1 texel made half of those math papers just go away. And I'm going to actually link to the one that I used here to do most of this at the end, which is the GPU GEMS real-time fluid sim paper in 2D, which I think a lot of people have probably been exposed to before. But it looks more complicated than it is, trust me. So the main difference between going from a 2D to a 3D sim is pretty simple. It's just, instead of, in those slides where I mentioned we have 4 neighbors, instead of dividing by 4, we divide by 6. Like, big change, right? So there's really no change to the setup of the blueprint or the materials other than, instead of using simple UVs, I again use the encode volume coordinates function that is on the lower left there, which is just allowing us to look into a pseudo volume texture, as I mentioned before. And other than that, it's exactly the same. So the fluid sim example that I have for 3D is a little bit different. It's not just swirling a field. It was trying to do things like creating explosions or fire and things like that. So the setup is slightly different for how I'm starting the sim. Basically, I have a seed material for the velocity and a seed material for the density and temperature initially, rather than it being just a click and drag kind of fun Java-ish demo like the other one. And so doing this sort of seeding takes a little bit of thought to get a nice result. The first one that I'd like to point out is we now have curl noise inside of Unreal Engine 4's material editor as just a default node. And that's under the node called vector noise, which you see on the bottom left there. And so curl noise is really great for fluid simulation. Beyond just giving you a nice random chaotic field, which can be used for cool little swirling details here and there, but it also is inherently a divergence-free field, which means at any point, if you do that whole calculation of offset neighbors, how much is going inverse out, it's always going to be completely divergent-free. And that's helpful inside of a 3D fluid sim, or any fluid sim really, because typically, if you notice in this explosion, the velocities are the most intense for the first couple of frames. So when you have a divergence-free field to start with, it takes a lot of the pressure, which, bad pun, off of the iteration solver, because it already starts divergent-free. It doesn't need to correct a bunch of incorrect velocities that you told it to start with. And then the next step is actually to seed the color. I shouldn't say density, because one of the key things that makes this simulation stuff possible so simply is we assume a constant density through our field. So it's basically like, imagine that was underwater and there's just some dye rather than being smoke, which for smoke in the air is a reasonable assumption because the smoke particles are not really existing in some higher density space in and of themselves, unless you account like for the molecular weight, which is a little bit beyond simple fake game simulations. So the next step is to simulate or seed the color, which I use Voronoi noise here. And this is actually very similar to that same blueprint or that same image I showed at the start of this, where I had the sphere I was just dragging around to position. And then using Voronoi noise gives it that kind of billowy shape at the bottom. And then I'm also seeding the temperature by using an eroded version of that same density or color map, which is basically why before that explosion blows out, you see kind of a hot core inside of that smoke that still matches the same pattern. And that's important because it creates more of a coherent look. And it's almost like starting the simulation a few frames ahead. I tried doing things initially like actually starting an explosion from inside of a physically grenade-sized thing, but it turns out that's not such a good idea. And in talking to other effects artists, they wouldn't really do that inside of Houdini or Maya fluid sims anyways. They would start with a reasonably sized little ball of smoke with some velocity and go from there, because starting from a grenade, to solve that to look good, you basically were, if you wanted to seed and say I have a tiny fist-sized velocity that gets the size of this room, you really need to actually solve the pressure wave propagation, which is not something we're going over in this. So there's a lot of interesting effects that you can come up with to manipulate these fields, including using curves for adding in more emission to the field. Like in the last two-dimensional simulation, I was clicking and dragging, and that was adding some temperature. You can also use things like a curve, which you can just drag those nice points around to control how long is more color or velocity information being added into our seed point, rather than just being a once-and-done thing. Or you can use more curl noise to add constant noise into the effect, which does things like creates more wispy detail, like maybe wind is blowing through. Or you can even create vector fields of a vortex, which that's actually what is being shown on the bottom left there, which the math for creating that is pretty simple. It's basically you take the UV coordinates and you subtract the center point that you want that to be centered around, and then you do what's called a swizzle, where you swap the x and the y, and that just creates that field. Well, I believe it's basically, instead of xy, it's negative yx, and that creates a vortex, which is also divergence-free, because at any point the same number of fluid is entering versus leaving every cell. The one point where that's not true is in the very center cell, which if we had infinite resolution, it would be true. But because we have a finite resolution in our texture, there is a tiny little point of divergence at the middle, which doesn't really matter, but it's worth noting just so I don't give you guys a bad idea. And I'm actually going to jump back into the editor real quick and play. This was just the backup video that you're seeing on that slide there in case the editor happened to stop working on me. And we can play with some of those settings that I mentioned. So here is that little same Raymark shader before, where we have our little density based off of the Voronoi noise, and we have temperature inside, which you can see I can actually go inside of and look at, which is kind of cool. So when we go back a little bit and start to simulate, we actually can see that smoke rising. And I can start to play with some of the parameters. Like, what if I want to, again, turn off the temperature? I see just some crazy, weird, inky effect. And you might notice I mentioned curves before. This is actually hooked up with an emission curve, which I can start to play with. I'll go ahead and move this over here a little bit and hope we can see that. So you'll notice here that it's emitting fluid for quite a while. What if I just went back down and set that to pretty much 0? It's more an instant little puffball effect that slowly diffuses, which we can use this to kind of control how much and how long we're adding in information into the sim. So you can see that change the result a little bit. And obviously, if you do this with too much additional particles, it will eventually just fill up the entire box, which is not probably what you want, but maybe just to show that. And you can drag this key up like that, and now it's going to rapidly fill the entire volume. OK. Let me try to get this back to something a little bit reasonable before I go on to messing with other little parameters here. Go down to my fluid simulation materials in 3D, and I'm going to select the Advection material. And I mentioned before things like constant curl. I'm going to go down to, where did I have that? Constant temperature. Excuse me, guys. It's constant smoke. Where did I have that? Hang on, press clean up. Sorry, I had a couple extra nodes in here. So that's the temperature buoyancy. These are the, I believe, this might be it here. That's the scale, that's the pander. Force. Oh. That's frames. Here, I apologize. It should just take me 1 second to figure this out. One of these is the curl noise. I think this is it right here. Perlin curl. OK. So I should be able to reduce this and get different amounts of results from that. And again, going back to that, that blueprint before, I can kind of change where I want to spawn this fluid. And starting near the bottom is obvious because we have the temperature buoyancy, so we want to give it a little bit of room to rise. Whereas if we started at the top, it's just going to quickly start hitting that wall, especially once we have our temperature buoyancy, which I think I disabled in that material. So one thing I'd like to mention that we have in the engine now is actually content-only plugins, which you'll notice down here on the content browser. We hide the regular content. We have this volume functions content, which allows you to have things like project-specific content plugins. So I've created this. Yeah. We got to wrap it up. Well, I'm getting the word that we're actually running out of time here, but content plugins allow you to share content across projects without having to have a code plugin in a very easy and simple way. And we're planning to release all of this stuff here as a content plugin that we can show and release hopefully either on the marketplace or some place we'll communicate via the forums. So before wrapping all this up, one thing I'd like to mention is that while the two-dimensional fluid simulation stuff is actually possible to get it in some performance state for a game, the 3D fluid simulation currently is still pretty hefty on the GPU. So for a lot of applications, it's a good idea to bake that down to just a regular Flipbook. And I'm showing here a slide that has the basic setup for rendering out a sub-UV from a scene capture actor. And so notice that to do that, we actually end up compositing these images using tiny parts of the overall render target. And it's some simple 1D to 2D math conversion that allows us to convert that framed count into a two-dimensional location. And then we end up with just a Flipbook instead of the full simulation. So we can use that to capture it out to a static texture. And then also here, going to bring up the final reference slide, which shows some of the links that I've been talking about throughout the presentation, as well as a write-up that I've done for some of these volumetric effects that I talked about. Thank you guys all for watching. This has been a lot of fun, and thanks.